In the grim darkness of the far future, there are horrors beyond comprehension. There are torments that strip away sanity like acid dissolves flesh. There are transformations so grotesque that even witnessing them can shatter the mind of a mortal human. But among all the nightmares that crawl through the galaxy's darkest corners, few scenarios match the sheer wrongness of what occurs when Orks capture a Chaos Dreadnought in the midst of its mutation into a Helbrute. This is a tale of two reality-warping forces colliding in ways that should not be possible, creating something that exists in defiance of natural law, corrupted theology, and any remaining shred of mercy the universe might once have possessed. To understand the true horror of this convergence, we must first understand each element separately. We must peer into the tortured existence of the Helbrute, that living prison where flesh and metal merge in agonizing union. We must comprehend the brutal simplicity of Ork technology, powered not by science, but by collective belief, strong enough to bend reality itself. And then, when we have grasped these individual nightmares, we can begin to imagine what happens when they become one. This is not a story of heroes or noble sacrifice. This is not a tale of glorious battle or righteous victory. This is the account of what happens when the galaxy's most enthusiastic scavengers stumble upon something already in the process of becoming an abomination, and decide that with a few modifications, some extra gubbins, and a proper coat of paint, they can make it even more spectacular. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, this kind of terrible innovation is not only possible, but inevitable. The Orks, in their crude enthusiasm, do not recognize boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between the machine and the demon, between what should be and what absolutely should not. The tormented origins. Understanding the Helbrute. Before we can comprehend what happens, when Orks interfere with a mutating Helbrute, we must first understand exactly what a Helbrute is, and why its very existence represents one of the cruelest fates imaginable in a galaxy already saturated with cruelty. A Helbrute begins its existence as a Chaos Dreadnought, and that Chaos Dreadnought typically begins its existence as a Space Marine Dreadnought. In the Imperium of man, to be interred within a Dreadnought is considered a great honor. When a Space Marine suffers mortal wounds but his chapter's apothecaries determine that his mind and will remain strong, he may be offered this chance at continued service. His broken body is placed within an armored sarcophagus, connected by cybernetic implants and mind impulse units to a walking weapons platform that stands 3 to 4 times the height of a normal human. The Marine becomes the machine, his consciousness directing its movements, his will channeling its weapons. Imperial dreadnoughts spend most of their time in deep sleep, awakened only when their chapter has dire need of their experience and firepower. They are revered as living relics, honored ancients whose wisdom spans centuries or even millennia. For Chaos Space Marines, everything about this process becomes corrupted and twisted. The traitor legions lost much of their technical knowledge after the Horus Heresy. Unlike their loyalist counterparts, they no longer possess the technology to create proper stasis systems or maintain the sophisticated life support that makes long-term interment bearable. Without these safeguards, without the rituals and prayers to the Omnissiah that keep an Imperial Dreadnought's machine spirit calm, the experience of being bound into a Chaos Dreadnought becomes a living nightmare. The Space Marine inside is fully conscious, trapped in a claustrophobic metal coffin with only a narrow slit through which to view the world. He cannot feel his body because he no longer has a body in any meaningful sense. What remains of his flesh is suspended in amniotic fluid, wired directly into the Dreadnought systems. Every sensation is filtered through mechanical sensors. Every movement is transmitted through hydraulic actuators and servo motors. The Marine experiences a profound disconnect from his former existence, a severing from everything that once defined his identity as one of the Emperor's chosen warriors. In Imperial service, this might be endurable. A loyalist dreadnought sleeps between battles, dreams whatever dreams his damaged brain can still conjure, and awakens to serve his chapter with dignity. But Chaos Dreadnoughts receive no such mercy. They are kept conscious, seething in their metal prisons, driven slowly mad by isolation, pain, and the constant whispers of the warp. Between battles, their sarcophagi are disconnected from the dreadnought chassis and left to hang in darkness. The Marine inside, left to contemplate his imprisonment with no hope of escape, except the one thing that Chaos denies: him, death. The transformation from Chaos Dreadnought to Helbrute represents an even further degradation, a descent into a state that makes the previous torment seem almost bearable by comparison. This mutation occurs when the warp's corruption becomes so intense that it begins to literally fuse the pilot's remaining organic tissue with the mechanical systems of the dreadnought itself. This is not a quick process. It is not merciful. It happens gradually, over years or decades or centuries, as the energies of the Imperium work their slow poison into every molecule of the machine. The flesh inside the sarcophagus begins to change. It grows. It spreads. Tumorous masses of mutated tissue push against the walls of the containment pod, seeking escape, seeking expansion. The pilot's awareness fragments and reforms, sometimes experiencing the growth as an extension of self, sometimes perceiving it as an invasion of something alien and hostile. The distinction becomes increasingly meaningless as time passes. What was the Marine and what is the mutation become impossible to separate. Outside the sarcophagus, the dreadnought's armor plates begin to show signs of organic corruption. Metal that should be inert and dead develops what looks disturbingly like skin. Ceramite panels take on textures that suggest muscle tissue. Joints that should move with mechanical precision instead flex and pulse with movements that appear biological. The machine is becoming flesh, even as the flesh is becoming machine, the two substances merging into a hybrid that belongs to neither category. This is the mutation process that creates a Helbrute. Games Workshop's lore describes these entities as being completely insane, and this is not hyperbole. The psychological trauma of this transformation cannot be overstated. Imagine being trapped inside your own body as it changes in ways you cannot control, cannot understand, cannot even fully perceive. Imagine feeling metal becoming meat and meat becoming metal, feeling your consciousness spread throughout a structure that grows larger and more complex, even as it becomes more alien to your original form. Imagine experiencing this for years, decades, centuries, with no hope of relief, no promise of ending, nothing but the endless cycle of mutation and madness. The resulting Helbrute is a horror to behold. It stands between 12 and 15 feet tall, a bipedal weapons platform that combines the firepower of a small tank with the close combat capabilities of a dedicated assault unit. But unlike an Imperial dreadnought, which maintains clean lines and purposeful design, a Helbrute is a mass of contradictions. Armor plates grown over with what looks like diseased skin. Weapon mounts that terminate in appendages that could be mechanical or biological or somehow both. Optical sensors that glare with a hatred that seems altogether too organic for a machine. Every surface bears the marks of warp corruption, from the symbols of the dark gods carved or grown into the hull, to the emanations of malevolent energy that shimmer around it like heat haze. The pilot, if that word even still applies, exists in a state of permanent rage and suffering. Most Helbrutes are kept chained between battles because they will attack anything within reach, friend or foe, driven by a madness that makes them as dangerous to their own warband as to their enemies. When battle comes, they are unleashed like rabid beasts, given a target and set loose to destroy everything in their path. This is their only relief, the only time when the pain and madness have an outlet, when they can express their torment through violence against anything unfortunate enough to be in their way. But this is the completed transformation. This is what a Helbrute looks like after the mutation has run its course, after the flesh and metal have found their terrible equilibrium. What happens during the mutation itself, while the process is still ongoing, is something else entirely. It is during this intermediate stage that the entity is most vulnerable, most unstable, most prone to catastrophic failure or unexpected transformation. The warp energies are actively reshaping reality around and within the mutating dreadnought. The boundaries between the material and immaterial are thin to the point of transparency. The pilot's consciousness is fragmented, parts of it still clinging to memories of being a space marine, parts of it subsumed into the spreading mutations, parts of it already lost to pure madness. This is the state in which our hypothetical Helbrute exists when the Orks find it. Not a completed transformation, not a fully realized Helbrute, but something caught between states, a work in progress that the forces of chaos had not yet finished sculpting. The mutation is active, spreading, changing moment by moment. Tendrils of demonic flesh are growing through the mechanical systems. The sarcophagus is bulging with the pressure of transformed tissue. The entire structure is wreathed in warp energy, reality itself bending around it like light around a black hole. And into this scene of cosmic horror stumble the Orks, the galaxy's most enthusiastic looters, who look upon this writhing mass of corrupted flesh metal and think one simple thought: that looks proper killy, we should take it. The Green Tide, understanding Ork technology and philosophy. To understand what happens next, we must shift our perspective entirely. We must leave behind the gothic horror of chaos corruption and enter the brutal, pragmatic, and utterly alien worldview of the Orks. These are not creatures who understand or care about the metaphysical implications of their actions. They do not contemplate the theological ramifications of interfering with warp-spawn transformations. They see a big, dangerous machine that could be made even more dangerous with some proper Orky modifications, and that is the beginning and end of their consideration. The Orks are a biological weapons race, engineered millions of years ago by the Old Ones as warrior organisms to fight in the war in heaven. That ancient conflict is long ended, the Old Ones themselves extinct or ascended or simply gone, but their creations endure. The Orks spread across the galaxy like a green fungal infection, reproducing through spores, growing from the smallest snotling to the largest war boss, through a life cycle driven entirely by violence and conflict. They are built for war in every sense of the word. Their muscular frames can shrug off wounds that would kill a normal human. Their rudimentary nervous systems mean they feel pain differently, treating injuries as annoyances rather than debilitating trauma. Their psychology is geared entirely toward combat, seeking out fights with an enthusiasm that borders on joy. But what makes Orks truly unique in the 40K universe is not their physical toughness or their love of violence. What sets them apart is their relationship with reality itself, mediated through a psychic phenomenon called the WAG. The WAG is difficult to explain in conventional terms because it operates on principles that defy normal causality. It is a gestalt psychic field generated by Orks when they gather in sufficient numbers. The more Orks in one place, the stronger the WAG energy becomes. This energy does more than just boost their morale or make them fight harder. It literally alters reality to conform to Ork expectations. If enough Orks believe that red vehicles go faster, then red vehicles actually do go faster when driven by Orks. If they believe that a weapon cobbled together from scrap metal and wishful thinking should fire bullets, then it fires bullets, regardless of whether the mechanism should actually function. This is not magic in the traditional fantasy sense, though it shares some similarities. It is not warp sorcery like that wielded by chaos sorcerers, though it does have psychic components. The WAG is its own category of reality manipulation, unique to the Ork species, a side effect of their engineered biology that makes their collective belief strong enough to override the normal laws of physics. Imperial tech priests have studied captured Ork weapons and found that when separated from Ork presence, many of them simply stop working. The mechanism that appeared functional reveals itself to be so crude, so poorly designed, that it should never have fired a single shot. But in the hands of an Ork, surrounded by other Orks, bathed in WH energy, it works perfectly because the Orks believe it should work. This brings us to the Mech Boys, the Ork caste responsible for building and maintaining all their technology. Mech Boys are not trained engineers in the human sense. They do not attend schools or read technical manuals. Instead, they are born with instinctive mechanical knowledge hard-coded into their genetic structure by the old ones millions of years ago. A Mech Boy knows how to build a functioning engine, not because he learned it, but because something in his DNA tells him where to put the pieces, how to connect them, what the result should look like. This knowledge is imprecise and crude by Imperial or Tau standards, but it is functional, and when combined with WH energy, it produces results that often surpass more sophisticated technology. Mech Boys are the spiritual leaders of Ork society, in the same way that Pain Boys, Ork doctors, and Weird Boys, Ork psychers, are. They are odd boys, Orks, who are genetically predisposed to fill specific roles within their culture. While the vast majority of Orks are simply boys, warriors who exist to fight and little else, the odd boys possess specialized abilities that make them indispensable. A Mech Boy's ability to build vehicles, weapons, and war machines is what enables a WAG to function. Without mechs, Ork technology would grind to a halt. The bikes would stop running, the guns would jam, the crude spacecraft that carry Orks between stars would fall apart in the void. But Mech Boys are not just builders. They are innovators, experimenters, tinkerers driven by an unquenchable urge to make things that are bigger, louder, more powerful, more spectacular than anything that came before. An Ork Mech Boy will cheerfully sacrifice practicality, safety, or even basic functionality in pursuit of a weapon that makes a particularly satisfying noise when it fires. They will bolt together incompatible systems just to see what happens. They will ignore every principle of sound engineering if the result looks proper Orky. This creative chaos is particularly evident when Mech Boys encounter technology from other races. Orks are prolific looters. After every battle, they swarm across the battlefield collecting wreckage, salvaging anything that looks useful or interesting. Imperial tanks, Eldar vehicles, Tau battlesuits, even Tyranid bioconstructs, all of it gets hauled back to the Ork. Workshops to be examined, dismantled, and incorporated into new Ork creations. The mechs have no respect for the original design or intended purpose of these items. An Imperial Lascannon might be bolted onto a war buggy alongside a makeshift flamethrower and a ram made from scrap metal. A Tau drone's sophisticated targeting system might be ripped out and replaced with a proper Orky gun sight that consists of a piece of bent metal with a hole drilled in it. The genius of this approach, if it can be called genius, is that it actually works. The WAG field makes it work. A weapon that should never fire because half its components are missing or replaced with incompatible parts will nonetheless spit bullets or energy blasts when an Ork pulls the trigger, because the Ork believes it should work, and the WAG agrees. This gives Mech Boys a freedom that no human engineer could ever possess. They are not bound by the limitations of their materials or the constraints of physical law. If they can imagine it and build something that vaguely resembles it, the WAG will handle the rest. This brings us to an important point about Ork culture and psychology. They do not fear chaos, corruption, or the warp in the way that humans do. Humans understand, or think they understand, the dangers of chaos. They know that exposure to warp energy can corrupt the soul, twist the body, damn the spirit to eternal torment. Even space marines, who are psychologically conditioned to resist such corruption, treat chaos artifacts with caution and respect. But Orks do not have this fear because they do not have this vulnerability. Orks possess their own gods, Gork and Mork, brutal deities of cunning brutality and brutal cunning respectively. These gods are warp entities, formed from the collective psychic gestalt of the entire orc species across the galaxy. They are, in essence, the whack given divine form. When an orc thinks about spiritual matters at all, which is rare, he thinks about Gork and Mork. The Chaos Gods might as well not exist for all the attention orcs pay them. This is not because orcs are somehow more enlightened or spiritually pure than humans. It is simply because the Chaos Gods, who feed on emotions like rage, despair, ambition, and excess, find little nourishment in orc psyches. An orc feels rage, certainly, but it is a simple, uncomplicated rage, focused entirely on the joy of fighting. They have no concept of hatred, as Khorne understands it, no capacity for the subtle corruptions that Sench weaves, no interest in the sensations that Slaanesh offers. As a result, orcs can interact with chaos artifacts, chaos technology, even chaos demons, with a level of casual disregard that would horrify any sane human. They do not see these things as spiritually dangerous because they do not recognize spiritual danger. A demon is just another enemy to fight. A chaos weapon is just another gun to loot. And a mutating Helbrute, caught in the throes of warp-spawned transformation, is just another piece of interesting scrap to haul back to the workshop. This is the mindset that the mech boys bring to their examination of captured technology. They approach each piece with enthusiasm, unconstrained by caution or concern for consequences. They have no concept of "this should not be touched" or "this is too dangerous to modify." Every constraint is just another challenge to overcome with sufficient application of violence and ingenuity. Every warning is advice to be cheerfully ignored. Every safety mechanism is a useless bit that should probably be removed to make room for more guns. Now imagine this mindset applied to a chaos dreadnought actively mutating into a Helbrute. Imagine the mech boys looking at this writhing mass of flesh metal horror and seeing not an abomination against nature, but an opportunity. Imagine them discussing among themselves, in their guttural language, how they could make this thing even bigger, even louder, even more destructive. Imagine them completely failing to understand or care about the warp energies, still actively reshaping the structure, the demonic influence that permeates every molecule. The consciousness trapped within that is already fragmenting under the strain of mutation. To the orcs, these are just details. Interesting details perhaps, but nothing that should stop them from getting to work with their welding torches and hammers. The acquisition. How orcs capture the impossible. The battlefield is a portrait of devastation, painted in fire and blood. The world's name does not matter. Perhaps it is some imperial frontier world, caught in the path of a Chaos Warband's raid. Perhaps it is a contested zone where multiple factions clash without purpose or victory. What matters is that here, in this place of screaming metal and dying flesh, forces of Chaos Space Marines clash with an orc wag, and in the chaos of combat, something rare is about to happen. The Chaos Warband has deployed one of their dreadnoughts, an ancient warrior whose name was already legend when the Imperium was young. For 10,000 years, he has served the dark gods, his consciousness trapped in a walking prison of ceramite and hate. But recently, his masters have noticed changes. The dreadnought's armor has begun to develop organic textures. The pilot's screams over the Vox channels have taken on a quality that suggests transformation rather than mere madness. The mutation has begun, the slow conversion from Chaos Dreadnought to full Helbrute, and the Warband's warpsmiths have been observing the process with interest, recording its progress for their dark researches. But they have made a critical miscalculation. They have deployed this mutating dreadnought into battle before the transformation is complete, thinking the combat would perhaps accelerate the process, channel the rage and pain into the desired outcome. What they have not accounted for is the orcs. The wag crashes into the chaos lines like a green tsunami. Ork vehicles thunder across cratered ground, their engines roaring with a volume that drowns out even the screams of the dying. Boys pour from transports, firing wildly as they charge toward the enemy, caring nothing for the return fire that cuts through their ranks. Deaf dreads lumber forward on piston-driven legs, their multiple arms bristling with guns and close combat weapons, bellowing their eagerness for destruction. The mutating dreadnought tears through the Ork assault with terrible efficiency. Its weapons, still maintaining some semblance of their original Imperial design despite the corruption spreading through the chassis, cut down boys by the dozen. Its power fist crushes a killer can like tin foil. For a moment, it seems unstoppable, an engine of destruction that no amount of Ork enthusiasm can overcome. But Orks do not understand the concept of unstoppable. They see the dreadnought killing their compatriots and think only that it is a good fight, the kind of scrap worth singing about later. More vehicles converge on its position. A battle wagon rams into its side, the impact staggering even something as massive as a dreadnought. Knobs pile on, their power claws seeking gaps in the armor. And then, critically, a mech boy driving a truck laden with experimental weapons decides to test his latest creation, a jury-rigged tractor beam built from parts looted from a Tau deployment. The device should not work. Its components are incompatible, its power source inadequate, its design fundamentally unsound. But it is being operated by an Ork, surrounded by thousands of other Orks, all of them absolutely convinced that Day New Grab-A-Gun will do exactly what the mech boy says it will do. The WAG field warps probability, and the device fires, projecting a beam of crackling green energy that locks onto the dreadnought. What happens next is not supposed to be possible. The dreadnought is in the middle of active mutation, its structure partially phased between material reality and the Imperium. Warp energies are actively reshaping its form. Under normal circumstances, trying to physically manipulate something in this state should result in catastrophic warp instability, potentially tearing a hole in reality itself. But the WAG field does not care about what should happen. It cares about what the Orks believe will happen, and the Orks believe that the Grab-A-Gun will grab things, mutation or no mutation, warp energy or no warp energy. Reality bends. The two forces, warp corruption and WAG energy, collide in ways that make nearby weird boys scream and clutch their heads. Purple and green lightning arcs between the dreadnought and the truck. For a moment, everything seems to freeze, time itself unsure how to proceed when confronted with such fundamentally incompatible events occurring simultaneously. Then, the dreadnought moves. Not under its own power, but dragged by the tractor beam, its massive form sliding across the battlefield despite its struggles. The Chaos Space Marines realize too late what is happening. They try to intervene, to recover their mutating comrade, but the Orks are already swarming the area. A weird boy, driven to a frenzy by the convergence of energies, unleashes a blast of psychic power that creates a temporary barrier of green lightning, cutting off the chaos forces from their dreadnought. The Orks do not waste time. With the organization that emerges when they are focused on a specific task, they attach chains to the dreadnought, loop cables around its struggling form, and begin the process of hauling it toward their lines. The entity inside the sarcophagus, its consciousness already fragmenting under the strain of mutation, experiences this as a new horror added to existing torment. It is being captured, looted, treated as salvage by these crude Xenos. The rage is indescribable, but rage is not enough to break the bonds that now hold it. As the Orks drag their prize back toward their camp, the mutation continues. They can see it happening in real time. Flesh growing through gaps in the armor, metal plates developing what looks disturbingly like veins. Some of the boys find this unsettling. Others find it proper weird in a way that is more interesting than frightening. The mech boys, when they see what has been captured, experience something close to religious ecstasy. Here is a machine unlike anything they have encountered before, something that is still changing, still transforming. The possibilities are endless. One of the big mechs, an orc who stands head and shoulders above his fellows, and whose workshop contains the accumulated salvage of 100 battles, examines the writhing dreadnought with eyes that gleam with avarice and inspiration. He walks around it, occasionally poking at the corrupted armor with a wrench, watching how the flesh metal responds to stimulus. He discusses with his fellow mechs what they are seeing, though discuss might be too civilized a word. It is more a shouted exchange of observations, punctuated by gestures, and the occasional demonstration involving hitting the dreadnought with various tools. "Looks like it's growing more bits," observes one mech, pointing at where a tendril of mutated tissue is slowly extending from a gap between armor plates. "We can make it grow more bits," suggests another, already thinking about what organs might be grafted onto the structure, what weapons could be mounted on those growing appendages. "Needs more dakka," says a third, because every orc vehicle or weapon can always benefit from more dakka. The big mech silences them with a gesture that suggests authority earned through being the biggest and having the best tools. "We's gonna take dis back to the workshop," he declares. "Gonna figure out what makes it tick. Den we's gonna make it proper orky." The other mechs nod enthusiastically. This is the opportunity of a lifetime, or at least of the current. Wag! They have captured something that should not exist, something caught between states, something still transforming, and they are going to modify it. The implications of what they are about to attempt do not occur to them. The theological ramifications of interfering with a warp-spawned mutation mean nothing to creatures who barely understand theology. The potential dangers of mixing orc technology with chaos corruption do not register as concerns worth considering. They see a challenge and an opportunity, and that is enough. As the dreadnought is hauled toward the orc workshop, secured with enough chains to restrain a gargant, the entity inside experiences the transition as another layer of nightmare added to its existing torment. It is still changing, flesh still spreading through mechanical systems, consciousness still fragmenting into shards of awareness scattered throughout its expanding form. But now there is a new sensation, a new presence pressing against its corrupted psyche. The Wah field, that gestalt psychic phenomenon that surrounds all orc gatherings, begins to seep into the cracks that the mutation has opened in its being. This should not be compatible. Chaos corruption and Wah energy operate on fundamentally different principles, draw from fundamentally different sources, but should not, has ceased to have meaning in this context. The mutation has weakened the barriers that would normally keep such forces separate, and the orcs, in their ignorant enthusiasm, are about to tear down what few barriers remain. The Workshop of Madness, Initial Examination and Modifications. The Orc Workshop is a cathedral of controlled chaos, if controlled, can describe anything in orc culture. It is a vast structure, cobbled together from salvaged materials, its walls made from the hulls of destroyed vehicles, its roof and patchwork of metal sheets held together by welds of questionable quality. Inside, the air is thick with smoke from forge fires. Smell of promethium and burning metal, the constant cacophony of hammering, grinding, and the occasional explosion when an experiment fails spectacularly. The workshop is organized, after a fashion, into different zones. One area contains partially disassembled vehicles, orc mechs crawling over them like green mechanics, replacing parts, adding weapons, painting everything in bright colors. Another zone houses weapon racks where shooters, choppers, and more exotic armaments wait to be mounted on vehicles or distributed to boys. A third area is dedicated to the construction of new machines, skeletal frameworks that will eventually become trucks or battle wagons or deaf dreads once enough pieces are bolted together. Into this industrial pandemonium, the mech boys drag the captured Helbrute in progress. They clear a space in the central workshop area, shoving aside other projects with the casual disregard of artisans who know they can always reassemble things later. The dreadnought is positioned in the center of the cleared space, still bound by chains, still occasionally twitching as mutations ripple through its structure. The big mech, who claimed salvage rights, stands before it, surrounded by his assistants and apprentices. Spanners, young mechs still learning the trade, crowd around with tools and eager expressions. Other odd boys have been invited to observe. A pain boy who specializes in grafting bio-augments onto orc warriors. A weird boy whose psychic sensitivity makes him invaluable for detecting energy flows. Even a few curious knobs who heard about the strange capture and wanted to see it for themselves. The examination begins with the kind of methodical approach that orcs rarely display outside their technical pursuits. The big mech walks around the dreadnought slowly, tapping on armor plates with a wrench, listening to the sounds the impacts make. Each section of the chassis produces a different tone, some clearly metallic, others with a disturbing organic quality that suggests flesh rather than ceramite. He notes where the mutations are most advanced, where the transformation has progressed to the point that metal and meat are nearly indistinguishable. "What we got here," the big mech announces to his assembled audience, "is a Yumi walker that's gone all weird, like it's turning into something else. Chaosy," suggests one of the spanners, who has seen chaos corruption before and recognizes the telltale signs. "Yeah, chaosy," agrees the big mech, as if this is just another design feature to work around. "But it don't matter none. Metal's metal, or near enough, and if it ain't metal yet, we'll make it metal." The pain boy steps forward, interested in the biological aspects of the transformation. He examines the areas where flesh is visibly growing through the mechanical systems, prodding at the tissue with instruments that look more like butcher's tools than surgical implements. "This stuff's still growing," he observes. "Could graft more onto it, add some squig organs, make it tougher." The weird boy keeps his distance, his eyes glowing with a faint green light as he senses the energies flowing through and around the captured machine. "There's something weird in there," he reports, though weird coming from a weird boy carries a certain weight. "Not like normal weird, like two kinds of weird fighting with each other." "What kinds?" asks the big mech, more curious than concerned. The weird boy struggles to articulate what he is sensing. His kind have an instinctive understanding of wah energy, but the warp corruption infusing the dreadnought operates on different principles, draws from different sources. "There's the purple, crackly weird," he says, gesturing at the corruption. "And then there's the green stompy weird," indicating the wah field that surrounds all orcs. "They don't like each other much. Will they blow up?" asks a practical-minded spanner. The weird boy considers this. "Maybe. Probably. Dunno." The big mech nods as if this is a perfectly acceptable level of risk assessment. "Right then, we'll just have to work fast, get the modifications done before it decides to explode." This is the point where any sane engineer, any responsible technician, anyone with even a basic understanding of safety protocols would stop and reconsider. The captured machine is unstable. It is infused with warp energy that should not interact with WAG fields. It is actively mutating in ways that are unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. Proceeding with modifications is asking for disaster. But orcs are not sane engineers or responsible technicians. They are creatures of action who view every warning as a challenge and every safety concern as something to ignore in pursuit of a bigger explosion. The big mech's decision to proceed is not bravery or foolhardiness. It is simply how orcs approach every problem, with enthusiasm, improvisation, and a fundamental belief that things will work out because they should work out. The modifications begin. The first order of business is to stabilize the dreadnought enough that they can work on it without it thrashing about or attempting to kill them. This proves more challenging than anticipated. Orc restraints are built for orc strength, which is considerable, but the mutating dreadnought possesses strength enhanced by both mechanical actuators and demonic corruption. Chains snap, cables part. A spanner who gets too close nearly loses an arm when the dreadnought's power fist activates unexpectedly. Eventually, they resort to a combination of approaches. More chains, welded directly to the floor. hydraulic clamps salvaged from an Imperial manufactory, reinforced with plates torn from a destroyed tank. And, critically, the weird boy using his abilities to project a WAG field directly into the dreadnought systems, essentially trying to crowd out the warp corruption through sheer psychic volume. This last measure produces immediate and alarming results. The moment the concentrated WAG energy touches the warp-corrupted systems, the conflict the weird boy sensed becomes visible. Purple lightning, the color of warp energy made manifest, arcs along the dreadnought's armor. It meets green lightning, the visible manifestation of WAG power, and where they touch, reality itself seems to hiccup. Small tears appear in the air, glimpses of something beyond normal space, that close almost as quickly as they open. The temperature fluctuates wildly, frost forming on metal surfaces that moments before were hot enough to burn. The dreadnought's struggles intensify. Whatever consciousness remains inside the sarcophagus is experiencing the collision of these forces as a new and unique agony. It has endured centuries of torment, has felt its flesh twisted by mutation, has experienced the slow dissolution of everything that once defined its identity. But this is different. This is two fundamentally incompatible forces trying to occupy the same space, using its body as the battleground. "Keep pouring it on," shouts the big mech, over the crackling of energies and the screaming of tortured metal. "We need it calm enough to work on." The weird boy complies, though the strain is visible on his face. Green energy pours from his outstretched hands, flooding into the dreadnought systems, and gradually, impossibly, it begins to work. The purple lightning dims. The warp corruption does not disappear, but it recedes, pushed back by the tide of WAH energy. The dreadnought struggles become less violent, not because it has accepted its fate, but because the two forces, wrestling for control of its form, have reached a temporary stalemate. "Right," says the big mech, picking up a massive cutting torch. "Let's get to work." What follows is a process that would be called surgery if performed on a living being, engineering if performed on a machine, and heresy if performed by anyone in the Imperium. The Ork mechs approach the dreadnought with tools and materials, ready to cut, weld, bolt, and hammer it into something more suitable to Ork tastes. The first modifications are practical, after the Ork fashion. The dreadnought's weapons, while formidable, are not proper Orky. The multi-melter it mounts on one arm is effective, but lacks the sheer volume of fire that Orks prefer. The big mech declares it must go, and despite protests from some of the spanners who appreciate the weapon's destructive potential, it is cut away with the torch. In its place, they begin mounting a cluster of big shooters, salvaged from destroyed vehicles and bound together with wire and hope. The configuration should not work. The ammunition feeds are incompatible. The recoil from all these guns firing simultaneously should tear the mount apart. But as the mechs work, the WAG field that suffuses the workshop begins to seep into the modifications, making them more viable than they should be, more functional than any Imperial engineer would deem possible. The Power Fist on the other arm presents a different challenge. It is a formidable close combat weapon, even by Ork standards, but it lacks the satisfying brutality of a proper power claw. The mechs debate among themselves how to improve it. One suggests adding a chainsaw blade to the fist, creating a hybrid weapon that can crush and cut simultaneously. Another proposes mounting a scorcher, an Ork flamethrower, into the arm so it can burn enemies even as it pounds them into paste. A third mech, showing unusual creativity, suggests that they could keep the Power Fist, but add more spiky bits to make it look more dangerous. They settle on a combination of all three approaches, because why choose when you can have everything? The Power Fist is reinforced with plates salvaged from a Death Dread, decorated with spikes torn from Chaos armor, and modified to include both a chainsaw attachment and a flamethrower nozzle. The result should be a dysfunctional mess. The weight distribution is wrong. The power requirements for all these systems exceed what the arm's power feeds can provide. But as the components are welded and bolted together, surrounded by Orks who absolutely believe this weapon will work, the WH40K field makes accommodations. Power flows where it should not. Structural stress distributes itself in ways that physics cannot explain. The weapon becomes functional because the Orks expect it to be functional. But the modifications go beyond simple weapon replacements. The Painboy, observing the mutations still slowly progressing through the Dreadnought's systems, decides that they can be enhanced, made more useful. He begins grafting on additional organic components, squig organs harvested from Ork bioconstructs, attempting to create what he describes as a proper Ardgit of a walker. Whether the Dreadnought's systems will accept these grafts is uncertain, but in the presence of both warp corruption and WH40K energy, the normal rules of biological compatibility have already been violated beyond recognition. Throughout all of this, the entity inside the sarcophagus experiences the modifications as a continuation of its transformation, but in a new and unexpected direction. The warp mutation was reshaping it into something that served the dark gods, an engine of chaos destruction. But now there is another force at work, one that does not care about the gods of chaos or their designs. The WH40K energy flowing through its systems is brutally simple in its purpose. Make the machine work, make it orky, make it fight better. This simplicity crashes against the baroque complexity of chaos corruption, and in the collision, something new begins to emerge. The Dreadnought is being pulled in two directions simultaneously. The warp corruption wants to transform it into a Helbrute, a being of fused flesh and metal dedicated to chaos. The Ork modifications want to transform it into something orky, a vehicle that embodies the crude enthusiasm and violent pragmatism of greenskin culture. Neither force is willing to yield to the other. Neither can completely overwhelm the other. And so, trapped between these competing influences, the entity begins to change in ways that neither force intended. Metal that had been becoming flesh under chaos corruption stops its transformation, but does not revert. Instead, it takes on properties of both substances, creating something that is neither metal nor meat, but some third category altogether. Organic growths that had been spreading through the mechanical systems encounter WH40K energy and transform, becoming tougher, more resilient, developing characteristics that make them useful rather than merely horrifying. The Ork grafts, which should reject in a body already saturated with warp corruption, instead find purchase, merging with the existing mutations to create hybrid structures that serve multiple purposes. The consciousness trapped within experiences all of this, with an awareness that is fragmenting even further. Parts of its mind still remember being a space marine, loyal to the Emperor, fighting in the Great Crusade. Parts have been consumed by chaos, transformed into something that serves the dark gods whether it wishes to or not. And now new parts are emerging, infected by the WH40K field's influence, taking on characteristics that are distinctly orky despite having never been Ork. These parts think in simpler terms, care less about grand destinies or cosmic conflicts, focus instead on immediate concerns like, does it fight good, and needs more Daka. The Big Mech, unaware of the psychological disintegration occurring within his project, steps back to admire his work. The Dreadnought has been transformed, though the modifications are far from complete. Where once it bore the clean, if corrupted lines of its chaos origins, it now sports a hodgepodge of Ork additions. The weapon mounts bristle with guns of various calibers. Armor plates have been reinforced with scrap metal welded on at seemingly random angles. And everywhere, covering every available surface, are the distinctive markings of Ork culture, painted symbols, crude glyphs, checkered patterns in garish colors. Needs more red, observes one of the spanners. The Big Mech nods. Paint is the final crucial step in any Ork modification. Red paint makes vehicles go faster, a fact that every Ork knows to be true, and which becomes true through the collective belief of the WAG. But this is not just any vehicle. This is something special, something unique. It deserves a paint job that reflects its status. They bring out buckets of paint in every color available to the Ork palette, which is to say, garish primary colors mixed with rust and oil. Red for speed, yellow for bigger explosions, blue for luck, purple for sneakiness, though using purple on something as large as a dreadnought seems like a waste, and black with white checkerboard patterns, because that is just proper. The painting is not a subtle process. It involves large brushes, or in some cases just throwing paint at the dreadnought and spreading it around with hands or rags. The goal is not artistic excellence, but comprehensive coverage, ensuring that every surface has been properly colored according to the Ork aesthetic. The warp-corrupted flesh that grows through the mechanical systems presents an interesting challenge. It resists the paint at first, as if the chaos corruption understands that being painted in Ork colors represents a fundamental denial of its nature. But the mechs persist, applying multiple coats, and gradually the paint takes hold, covering the mutated tissue in bright reds and yellows and blacks. With each layer of paint, with each modification bolted into place, with each moment spent in the workshop surrounded by Orks and their psychic field, the transformation progresses. The entity is becoming something that has never existed before in the long history of the galaxy. Not a Helbrute, not an Ork Def Dread, but something that combines elements of both and serves neither master completely. The warp corruption has not been eliminated. It still churns beneath the surface, still whispers promises and threats from the Imperium. But it has been contained, pushed back, forced to share space with another power that it cannot overcome or corrupt. The WAG field has not conquered the entity, has not made it truly Ork, but it has left an indelible mark, infused the structure with energies and beliefs that alter how the corrupted systems function. In the sarcophagus, the fragmented consciousness experiences brief moments of something approaching clarity. In these moments, it tries to understand what has been done to it, what it is becoming. The conclusions it reaches, to the extent it can still form conclusions, are not reassuring. It is trapped between worlds, between allegiances, between states of being. It is a Helbrute that has been orkified, or a Def Dread built from chaos components, or something else entirely that language has not yet invented words to describe. The only certainty is that when it is finally unleashed, when the Orks decide their modifications are complete and release it to battle, it will be unlike anything the galaxy has seen before. And in a universe already filled with horrors beyond counting, that is an impressive and terrifying achievement. The hybrid horror, understanding the final form. After days or weeks of modifications, the project reaches a state that the Big Mech declares good enough. This is not to say the work is finished. In Ork culture, nothing is ever truly finished because there is always room for more weapons, more armor, more painted flames or checkered patterns. But the entity has reached a functional state, a condition where it can be tested, deployed, used for its intended purpose of killing enemies and looking spectacular while doing so. The final form defies easy categorization. Imperial observers, if any survive to report back, would struggle to classify it in their taxonomies of Xenos technology and chaos corruption. It is larger than the dreadnought that was originally captured, the Ork modifications adding bulk, and the continuing mutations adding mass. It stands perhaps 16 to 17 feet tall now, a towering figure that dominates the workshop floor. Its silhouette is vaguely humanoid, maintaining the bipedal stance of its original design, but every detail proclaims its hybrid nature. The armor is a patchwork history of its transformation. Sections of original ceramite, corrupted by chaos and bearing the 8-pointed star or other symbols of the dark gods, exist alongside plates of Ork scrap metal crudely welded into place. Where the mutations have grown through the armor, the mech boys have not removed the organic growths. but instead reinforce them with metal bands and strips, creating a ribbed effect that makes those sections look like the exposed musculature of some giant. Paint covers everything in aggressive patterns, red and black predominating, with yellow lightning bolts added because they look dead killy. The weapons are perhaps the most visible sign of the modifications. The multi-melter is gone, replaced by a cluster of big shooters bound together with cable and hope. This cluster rotates when activated, a design that should cause the entire mount to shake itself apart, but instead produces a satisfying whirring sound as the barrels spin up. The Power Fist has become a monstrous hybrid of crushing claw, chainsaw blade, and flamethrower, decorated with spikes and painted in checks pattern. Additional weapons have been mounted wherever the mechs could find attachment points. A rocket launcher welded to the shoulder, a cluster of stick bombs attached to the hip, even a grot-manned gun position added to the back, where a particularly ambitious spanner decided there was wasted space. But these external modifications, dramatic as they are not the most significant changes. What matters more is what has happened internally, within the systems and the consciousness that pilots this hybrid abomination. The warp corruption and the WAG field have not merged. That would be too simple, too clean. Instead, they exist in a state of permanent conflict and cooperation, each trying to dominate the entity's functions while simultaneously being forced to work alongside the other. The warp energies still flow through the corrupted systems, whispering their promises of power and transformation. But those whispers are now competing with the brutal simplicity of Ork belief, the WAG field's insistence that things should work because they should work. This creates some paradoxical effects. The entity is simultaneously more and less stable than either a Helbrute or a Death Dread would be. The warp corruption makes it prone to unpredictable mutations, sudden surges of demonic strength, moments when reality itself seems to bend around it. But the WAG field acts as a crude stabilizer, imposing expectations of functionality that constrain the corruption's wilder manifestations. The result is something that is reliably unreliable, an engine of destruction that performs its basic functions with brutal efficiency, while occasionally doing things that make no sense from any perspective. The consciousness within has fragmented into multiple layers, none of which are entirely coherent, but all of which contribute to the entity's functioning. At the deepest level, there are still traces of the original Space Marine, memories of service and duty that surface at random moments. These memories are distant, distorted, viewed through layers of corruption and modification that make them seem like they belong to someone else. Above that layer lies the chaos corruption, the influence of the warp that has transformed the Marine into something that serves the dark gods. This layer carries the rage and madness typical of Helbrute pilots, the desperate desire to destroy everything as retaliation for its own endless suffering. It howls for violence, for blood, for the sensation of enemies being crushed and burned and torn apart. And above that, newest and strangest, is a layer of influence from the WAG field. This is not a true Ork consciousness. The entity has not become an Ork, but it has absorbed something of their perspective, their simple joy in combat, their belief that bigger is better and more Daka is always the answer. This layer thinks in cruder terms than the others, cares less about grand cosmic purposes or divine service, focuses instead on immediate, tangible goals, find enemies, shoot them, hit them, make them explode. These layers do not cooperate smoothly. They contradict each other, pull in different directions, compete for control of the entity's actions. But they cannot fully suppress each other, and the result is a consciousness that acts on multiple motivations simultaneously, creating behavior that is chaotic but not random, aggressive but not thoughtlessly so, directed but not predictable. The Big Mech conducts final tests before declaring the project ready. These tests involve activating various systems, checking that weapons fire properly, that locomotion functions, that the entity responds to commands. This last requirement is where things become interesting, because the entity has proven resistant to simple control. When the mechs try to hardwire it, like they would a normal Def Dread, installing control systems that should allow a pilot to direct its movements. The corrupted systems reject the modifications. The warp energies flowing through the entity refuse to tolerate external control, and the first Ork who tries to jack into the control systems finds himself experiencing a psychic backlash that leaves him unconscious for several hours. The Weird Boy suggests a different approach. Rather than trying to control the God Society entity directly, they should give it targets and let it pursue them autonomously. This is how Helbrutes are typically deployed in Chaos warbands, pointed at the enemy and released like rabid beasts. The Ork modifications have not changed this fundamental nature, though they have added capabilities the original designers never intended. When the entity is first activated for a full combat test, the workshop erupts in noise and light. The clustered shooters spin up, filling the air with the roar of multiple rotating barrels. The chainfist revs, its blades screaming against each other. The Weird Boy monitoring the psychic emanations reports feeling waves of mixed energies, purple warp corruption and green wah power radiating from the entity in pulses that make the air shimmer. Several Gretchen, sensitive to psychic energies in ways that larger Orks are not, flee the workshop in terror. But the entity does not immediately attack. It stands in the center of the workshop, weapons active, but not firing, as if assessing its situation. The fragmentary consciousness within is trying to understand where it is, what has been done to it, what it has become. This moment of hesitation worries the big mech, who expected the entity to rampage immediately, fulfilling its purpose as a weapon. Then the entity turns its sensor arrays toward the Orks surrounding it, and for a moment, every mech in the workshop tenses, hands moving to weapons, ready to defend themselves if this proves to be a mistake. The entity's optical sensors, one still relatively normal, and one that has mutated into something that looks more like an organic eye, scan across the assembled greenskins, and then it speaks. This should not be possible. The vocal systems of a dreadnought are designed for Vox communication, for broadcasting threats and orders in battle. The mutations should have rendered those systems inoperative, replaced them with something that produces demonic howls and screams. But the Ork modifications have added their own changes, including a Voxcaster that one of the spanners thought would be useful for yelling at Du Bois. What emerges from this hybridized system is a voice that belongs to no single source. It carries the mechanical rasp of a dreadnought's Vox system, the otherworldly resonance of warp corruption, and somehow, impossibly, an undercurrent of Ork accent and inflection. The words it speaks are a mixture of Gothic, the language of the Imperium, Dark Tongue, the language of chaos, and Ork guttural. Wag! It roars, and the word carries meanings from all three sources. It is a war cry, an expression of rage, and an acknowledgement of the force that has been woven into its being. The Orks, hearing this, break into cheers. Their creation, their hybridized monstrosity, has just declared allegiance to the Wach, or at least acknowledged it. This is more than they hoped for. They expected a mindless killing machine, something that would attack whatever. They pointed it at until it was destroyed. Instead, they have something that can think, can choose, can potentially coordinate with other elements of their forces. The big mech steps forward, massive wrench in hand, and addresses the entity. "Use one of Du Bois now," he declares, with the authority of the creator addressing his creation. "And Du Bois got lots of enemies to kill." The entity's response is to lift its chain fist and rev the blades, a gesture that in any language means acceptance of the challenge, agreement to the terms, eagerness to begin. The warp corruption within it howls for destruction. The whack influence pushes toward combat. The fragmentary consciousness that still remembers being a space marine finds itself carried along by these stronger currents, its protests meaningless in the face of such overwhelming drive toward violence. The entity is given a name by the Orks, as all significant war machines must have names. They call it the Stompin Skullcrusher, which reflects both its size and its purpose. The name is painted on its armor in crude letters, white paint over the red and black checkers, making it official by Ork standards. Over the following days, the entity is integrated into the warband's forces. It is given a designated position in the battle line, surrounded by other walkers, death dreads and killer cans that it towers over, but which serve as both support and, pragmatically, as obstacles should it decide to rampage toward its own lines. The Orks understand that this creation is dangerous, unstable, prone to unpredictable behavior. But they also understand that unpredictability can be a weapon in itself, that enemies who cannot anticipate what you will do next are enemies who are easier to kill. The entity experiences its integration into Ork forces with the disconnection of someone watching events happen to someone else. It knows it was once something different, something that served other masters. But those memories are distant, now, overlaid by the mutations, the modifications, the competing influences that make it what it has become. It is a Helbrute that will never fully become a Helbrute, a death dread built from the nightmares of chaos, a hybrid that exists in the spaces between classifications. And when it finally marches to war, when the WAG needs its particular combination of corrupted power and Ork enthusiasm, it will demonstrate exactly what happens when two reality-warping forces are forced to share the same physical form. The results will be spectacular, destructive, and utterly unlike anything the galaxy's warriors have encountered before. Unleashed, the hybrid's first battle. The battlefield is a ruined Imperial city, its hab blocks reduced to skeletal frameworks of twisted metal and crumbling rockcrete. The defenders are a mix of Astra Militarum infantry and a depleted company of space marines from a chapter whose name does not matter, for they are about to face something for which their training and experience have not prepared them. The Ork whack crashes into the Imperial lines with the subtlety of an asteroid impact. Boys pour from transports, roaring their enthusiasm as they charge across the rubble. Death dreads lumber forward on piston-driven legs, their weapons blazing. Battle wagons ram through barricades, scattering defenders or crushing them beneath tracks as wide as a man is tall. It is the kind of assault that the Imperium has faced countless times, across countless worlds, brutal and direct and seemingly unstoppable. But then something different emerges from the Ork lines. The entity that was once a Chaos Dreadnought, and is now something else entirely, advances toward the Imperial positions. And even from a distance, the defenders can tell that this is not a normal Ork walker. It is too large, too wrong, its movements suggesting both mechanical precision and organic fluidity in ways that should not coexist. The Space Marines recognize it first. One of their librarians, psychically sensitive, feels the warp corruption radiating from the entity even before he sees it clearly. Chaos, he warns over the vox, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining his mental shields against the emanations of warp energy. But something is wrong with it. The corruption is mixed with something else, something... He cannot complete the warning before the entity opens fire. The cluster of big shooters spins up, barrels rotating with a whir that builds to a scream, and then the weapons begin firing in sequence, creating a sustained roar of gunfire that sounds like continuous thunder. The shells are not uniform. Some are Ork slugs, crude bullets that should tumble and veer off course, but which fly true because the Orks believe they should. Others are bolts of warp energy, purple lightning that crackles through the air and explodes on impact with psychic force. The two types of ammunition should not be able to coexist in the same weapon system, but they do, alternating or mixing in patterns that seem random but achieve devastating effect. The Imperial defensive line shreds under the assault. Guardsmen die in explosions of blood and armor. A Chimera transport takes a warp-enhanced shell directly to its fuel tank and detonates, scattering flaming debris across a 100-meter radius. The Space Marines weather the storm better, their powered armor absorbing impacts that would kill normal humans. But even they are forced to take cover as the sustained fire continues. The entity advances while firing, its piston-driven legs eating distance with a gait that combines the mechanical precision of its dreadnought origins with something more organic, more predatory. The ground trembles with each step. The air around it shimmers with heat and psychic energy, and from its vox systems comes a continuous howl that blends mechanical noise with warp-touched screaming and, impossibly, what sounds like orc war cries. A Space Marine tactical squad attempts to target it with crack grenades and melter guns, the weapons designed to penetrate heavy armor. They fire in coordinated volleys, their shots precise despite the chaos of battle around them. The melter gun beams score direct hits on the entity's chest armor, superheating the metal and corrupted flesh beneath. For a moment, it seems like the tactic might work. The entity staggers, its advance halting as its systems process the damage. Then it retaliates. The Chain Fist, that hybrid monstrosity combining Power Fist, Chainsaw and Flamethrower, activates all its systems simultaneously. The power field crackles with energy that is both mechanical and warp-touched. The chainsaw blades scream as they bite into air, and from the flamethrower nozzle emerges not normal promethium fire, but flames that burn with purple and green light, a mixture of warp-spawned hell and orc-generated combustion that should not be able to exist in the same stream. The entity does not just swing the chain fist, it lunges forward with speed that belies its massive size, closing the distance to the Space Marine squad in seconds. The first Marine it reaches tries to parry with his chainsword, a weapon that has served him faithfully through decades of combat. The chain fist sweeps through the parry as if it was not there, the collision of weapons producing a shower of sparks and a screech of tortured metal. And then the chain fist makes contact with the Marine's armor. Power field, chainsaw blades, and flames all work on the target simultaneously. The Marine is crushed, cut, and burned in a single, terrible instant. His armor, blessed by the chapter's tech Marines and consecrated by the chaplains, designed to withstand anti-tank weapons and protect against all but the most grievous injuries, simply disintegrates under the assault. The Marine inside dies before his nervous system can even process the pain. The entity does not stop. It sweeps the chain fist through the squad, each impact destroying another Space Marine, each death adding to the monument of carnage it is creating. The survivors break and run, a response that would be unthinkable in most circumstances, but which becomes the only rational action when faced with something that kills through methods that combine the worst aspects of multiple forms of destruction. The guardsmen watching this massacre understand that they are seeing something unprecedented, something that their training manuals and tactical briefings did not prepare them for. Some break and flee, others freeze, paralyzed by fear that transcends rational thought. A few continue fighting, firing their laser guns at the entity, even though the small arms fire has no visible effect, because fighting is the only alternative to accepting that death is inevitable and imminent. The entity experiences the combat through its fragmentary consciousness, each layer perceiving the battle differently. The warp corruption exults in the destruction, feeding on the fear and death, growing stronger with each soul sent screaming into the Imperium. Every kill sends a pulse of dark satisfaction through the corrupted systems, the chaos energies drinking deep of the terror and agony that saturates the battlefield. The mutations writhe with pleasure as blood splashes across armor plates, as flesh tears beneath chainsaw blades, as the screams of the dying rise like prayers to uncaring gods. The WAG! Influence experiences the same violence in entirely different terms. It revels in the simple joy of a good fight, the satisfaction of watching enemies fall before its weapons, the visceral thrill of effective Daka and brutal chopper working in perfect violent harmony. This part of the entity's consciousness thinks in simple, enthusiastic terms. Dis is a proper scrap. Look at 'em run. Needs more shooting, but the crumpin' is good. There is no malice here, no theological satisfaction in corruption, just the pure, uncomplicated joy that orcs feel when they are doing what they were designed to do. And somewhere deep within, buried beneath layers of corruption and orkification. The fragment that still remembers being a space marine watches with horror at what it has become. This fragment recognizes the armor colors of the chapter it is fighting, might even remember faces from centuries ago when it served alongside their predecessors. It knows these are the Emperor's finest warriors, knows they are humanity's defenders, knows that every one of them who falls represents a loss that cannot easily be replaced in these dark times. The fragment screams warnings that no one can hear, tries to stop the attacks that its body executes with terrible efficiency, attempts to assert control over limbs that no longer respond to its will. It is trapped in a prison far worse than the original dreadnought sarcophagus, forced to witness atrocities committed with its own hands, powerless to prevent the slaughter of those it once would have died to protect. But that fragment is too small, too broken, too fragmented to influence the entity's actions. The corruption is stronger. The whack influence is louder. The combination of these forces drowns out any protests, any pleas, any desperate attempts at redemption. It can only watch, experience, and despair, knowing that this torture will continue as long as the entity continues to function, as long as the Orks continue to repair it, as long as the warp corruption continues to regenerate it. This internal conflict sometimes manifests in external behavior. Observers watching the entity fight might notice strange hesitations, moments where it seems to pull back from finishing a kill or pauses in the middle of executing a particularly brutal attack. These are the moments when the fragment manages to assert itself briefly, to create just enough resistance that the entity's actions become slightly less efficient. But these moments are rare, fleeting, and ultimately meaningless in the larger context of the slaughter. The Imperial forces, unaware of this internal struggle, see only a machine of destruction that shows no mercy, no hesitation, no weakness that they can exploit. They do not know that somewhere within that horror is a warrior who once served the same cause they defend. They cannot hear the silent screams of someone who remembers oaths sworn and brothers lost and a time before corruption claimed everything worth preserving. The battle continues for hours, the Orks pressing their advantage, while the Imperial forces attempt to regroup and mount an effective defense. The entity becomes a focal point of the combat, a moving storm of destruction that breaks whatever formations try to stand against it. At one point, the defending Space Marines attempt a desperate gambit, calling in an orbital strike on the entity's position. The lance beam from their strike cruiser in orbit burns through the atmosphere, a column of coherent light that should vaporize anything in its path. The entity sees the strike coming. The warp corruption within it senses the gathering energies. The whack influence recognizes danger, and in a moment of perfect synchronization between these normally competing forces, the entity does something that should be impossible. It generates a force field. Not a normal force field like those produced by Ork custom force field generators or Imperial conversion fields. This is something hybrid, something that combines the reality-bending power of both warp corruption and WAG energy. The field manifests as a sphere of crackling energy that surrounds the entity, purple and green lightning intertwining in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The orbital strike hits the field and disperses. Not deflected, not absorbed, but dispersed. The coherent beam breaking apart into harmless light and heat that wash over the battlefield without causing the devastation they should have delivered. The defenders watch in disbelief as their most powerful weapon fails, as something that should have ended the threat instead leaves it unharmed and even more terrifying. The entity does not understand how it generated the field. It simply knew it needed protection, and the field appeared, manifesting from the convergence of energies within its being. The fact that this should not work, that force fields do not spontaneously generate from belief and corruption mixed together, is irrelevant. The WAG field makes things work because Orks believe they should work. The warp corruption makes reality malleable to will and belief. Together, they have created an effect that neither could achieve alone. Throughout the battle, the entity displays capabilities that surprise even the Orks who created it. At one point, when surrounded by Imperial tanks, it seems to teleport short distances, vanishing from one position and reappearing meters away in a crackle of green and purple energy. Whether this is a warp-spawned ability or some bastardized version of Ork teleporter technology is unclear, and perhaps does not matter. What matters is that it works, allowing the entity to close with enemies that try to keep it at range. When it runs low on ammunition, which happens surprisingly quickly given the volume of fire it has been producing, something strange occurs. The big shooters that should now be empty continue firing, the wah field apparently conjuring new ammunition into existence or allowing the weapons to fire without consuming their stores. The rounds these phantom loads produce are less effective than normal ammunition, but they still inflict damage, still force enemies to keep their heads down. And when it suffers damage, when lucky shots from Imperial lascannons or the remaining Space Marines' heavy weapons penetrate its armor, the entity displays healing capabilities that are disturbing to witness. The damaged areas writhe with mutation, flesh and metal flowing together to seal breaches, corrupted. Tissue growing over exposed systems like scabs over wounds. The WAG field seems to enhance this regeneration, accelerating it beyond what even typical chaos regeneration would allow. By the time the battle ends with the Imperial forces broken and fleeing, the entity stands amid the ruins it has helped create, its armor scorched and damaged, but its core systems functional. Around it lie the bodies of enemies in numbers that would normally require an entire Ork warband to account for. It has proven itself in the way that matters most to Orks. It has killed exceptionally well. The big mech, surveying the carnage through magnoculars from a relatively safe position behind the Ork lines, nods with satisfaction. "Der Stompin Skull Crusher did good," he announces to the mechs around him. "But we can make it better, because that is the Ork way. Nothing is ever truly finished. There is always room for more weapons, more armor, more modifications that make the machine bigger, louder, more destructive." The fact that the entity has already demonstrated capabilities beyond what its designers intended does not mean they cannot improve it further. It just means they need to think bigger, add more gubbins, find new ways to make it even more spectacular. The entity, if it is capable of understanding such things, might feel despair at this realization. It is not finished transforming. It is not done being modified and altered and reshaped. The process that began when it was captured mid-mutation will continue, will perhaps never end, will keep changing it in ways that make what it has already become seem almost normal by comparison. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no peace for the weapons of war. There is only endless modification, eternal conflict, and the steady erosion of everything that once defined identity or purpose. The entity that was once a Space Marine, then a Chaos Dreadnought, then something caught between states, is now something new and terrible. And it will keep changing, keep evolving, keep becoming stranger and more terrible, because that is what happens when Ork enthusiasm meets chaos corruption, and neither force can claim total victory. The aftermath ripples across the galaxy. Word of the entity spreads through the fractured communication networks of the Imperium like a disease through an undernourished population. The surviving Space Marines from the first engagement transmit after-action reports that read more like fever dreams than tactical assessments. They describe a Chaos Walker corrupted with Ork modifications, a machine that displayed capabilities that should not coexist in any single platform, a horror that combined the worst aspects of multiple threats. The librarians who survived the battle add their own reports, documents heavy with psychic impressions and theological concerns. They describe sensing two different types of warp energy interacting in ways that violated established understanding. The purple lightning of chaos corruption intertwined with the green emanations of WAG power. creating harmonics that should have torn reality apart, but instead produced something stable, functional, and terrifying. These reports make their way through the Byzantine hierarchies of imperial command, passing from sector command to segmentum command to terror itself. In the halls of the Inquisition, senior members of the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus debate what the existence of such an entity might mean. Some argue it represents a new form of chaos corruption, the dark gods finding new ways to manifest their power. Others insist it is primarily an Ork threat, evidence of the greenskins' dangerous capacity for innovation when left unchecked. A few, the most radical and perhaps the most perceptive, suggest that it represents something else entirely, proof that the galaxy's supernatural forces are not as cleanly divided as imperial theology insists, evidence that there are forms of existence that fall between the established categories, threats that cannot be easily classified or countered using conventional approaches. The Mechanicus, when they receive fragments of technical data about the entity, respond with their own form of horror. Tech priests, who have spent centuries studying the sacred principles of the Omnissiah, find their understanding challenged by descriptions of weapons that should not function, systems that violate the established protocols of the machine god's gifts. Some declare it an abomination that must be destroyed. Others, particularly those of more radical leanings, see it as an opportunity to study how the Xenos' manipulation of technology might be incorporated into imperial designs, an idea that borders on heresy but remains technically within the bounds of exploratory research. But while the Imperium debates and studies and argues about theological implications, the Orks simply continue using their creation. The entity fights in engagement after engagement, each battle adding to its reputation among both the Orks and their enemies. It becomes known by multiple names across multiple warbands: Dustompin, Skullcrusher, among the Orks who first modified it; the Corrupted Walker in Imperial tactical briefings; the Abomination of Two Paths in Chaos Warband communications that reference its existence. The Chaos Forces, particularly those from the warband that originally deployed the Dreadnought, regard the entity with a mixture of rage and dark fascination. They have lost one of their war machines, yes, but they have also witnessed something unprecedented. A Helbrute in progress, captured and modified by Orks, continues to function despite the interference with its corruption. Some Chaos sorcerers see this as an insult to the Dark Gods, a violation of the natural order of warp-spawned transformation. Others view it as an opportunity, wondering if the Ork modifications might have accidentally created a new form of corruption, one that combines the strengths of multiple sources. There are reports, unconfirmed but disturbing, of Chaos warbands attempting to replicate the process. They capture Ork technology, try to graft it onto their own war machines, attempt to merge the crude effectiveness of Ork engineering with the reality-warping power of Chaos corruption. These experiments almost universally end in catastrophic failure. Without the WAG field to make the Ork components function, without the Gestalt psychic power of thousands of Orks believing that the modifications should work, the hybrid systems simply tear themselves apart. The failures teach an important lesson. What the Orks accomplished was not simply a matter of technique or engineering. It required the convergence of specific circumstances, the perfect storm of forces that cannot be deliberately recreated. The Helbrute had to be in active mutation, its structure already unstable and malleable. The WAH field had to be strong enough to impose its influence, but not so overwhelming that it destroyed the warp corruption entirely. The mech boys had to be skilled enough to modify the entity without triggering catastrophic failure, but ignorant enough not to realize what they were attempting was impossible. In other words, it was an accident that worked, the kind of one-in-a-million occurrence that can only happen when ignorance, skill, and cosmic forces align in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. And like all such accidents, it cannot be repeated deliberately without losing the essential element of chance that made it possible in the first place. This realization does not stop various factions from trying. Across the galaxy, in workshops and laboratories and warforged temples, different groups attempt different approaches to creating their own hybrids. The Imperium experiments with captured Ork technology, trying to understand how the Warg field makes impossible mechanisms function. Chaos forces try to corrupt Ork machines, hoping to create weapons that combine crude effectiveness with demonic power. Even some Ork mech boys, inspired by the success of their fellows, seek out more chaos artifacts to modify, hoping to create additional hybrids. Almost all of these attempts fail. Some fail quietly, the hybrid machine simply refusing to activate or function. Others fail spectacularly, explosions or warp rifts or demonic incursions marking the moment when incompatible forces finally reject each other completely. A few create short-lived successes, machines that function for hours or days before catastrophically failing, but none create anything as stable, as functional, as terrifyingly effective as the original hybrid that the Orks accidentally created when they captured a Helbrute mid-mutation. The entity itself continues to evolve. The mech boys cannot leave well enough alone, cannot resist the urge to tinker and improve and add more modifications. After its first few battles, they add more armor plating, reinforcing sections that took damage. After its 10th battle, they upgrade the weapon systems, replacing the original cluster of big shooters with an even larger assembly that includes heavy flamers and rockets alongside the ballistic weapons. After its 20th battle, they attempt to install a teleportation system, which partially works, but has a disturbing tendency to leave parts of the entity behind when it teleports, requiring the Pain Boys to graft on replacement components grown from squig organs. Each modification changes the entity further, adds new capabilities, creates new instabilities. The warp corruption and WAG influence continue their eternal struggle for dominance, neither able to overcome the other, both forced to coexist in the same increasingly complex structure. The consciousness fragments within experience each change as another layer of horror, another step away from anything that could be called sane or normal. By the time the entity has fought in 50 battles, survived a dozen assassination attempts by Imperial kill teams, and been captured and recaptured by different Ork warbands 3 times, it has become something that bears only superficial resemblance to what it was when first modified. It stands nearly 20 feet tall now, the accumulated modifications adding both height and mass. Its weapons are a mismatched arsenal of Ork, Imperial, and Chaos components, some looted, some purpose-built, some apparently grown from its own corrupted tissues. Its armor is a patchwork history of repairs and replacements, testament to countless battles and the Orks' determination to keep their creation functional, no matter how much damage it suffers. And within its sarcophagus, what remains of the original consciousness has been compressed into something so small, so fragmented, that it can barely be said to exist anymore. The warp corruption and WAG influence have claimed almost everything, leaving only the faintest trace of the warrior who was originally interred in the dreadnought. This trace persists not because it is strong, but because the two dominant forces cannot agree on how to eliminate it, each viewing the fragment as potentially useful leverage against the other. The entity has become a legend among the Orks, a story told around campfires and in workshops, an example of what can be achieved with sufficient enthusiasm and disregard for consequences. Young mech boys dream of finding their own chaos artifacts to modify, of creating their own legendary war machines. War bosses compete to have the entity fight alongside their forces, knowing that its presence on the battlefield often means the difference between mere victory and the kind of spectacular triumph that gets sung about for years. The existence of this hybrid entity raises questions that go beyond mere tactical or strategic concerns. It represents a metaphysical problem, a theological challenge to the established order of how the galaxy's supernatural forces are understood to operate. To properly comprehend the implications, we must examine what this hybridization means for the larger cosmic framework of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Chaos Gods are ancient and powerful entities that dwell in the warp, the Imperium, that roiling ocean of psychic energy that underlies and permeates reality. They are born from the thoughts, emotions, and beliefs of mortal beings across the galaxy, sustained by the very existence of sentient life. When a space marine is corrupted by chaos, when a dreadnought mutates into a Helbrute, that transformation is an expression of the Chaos God's power over the material realm. It is their victory, their claim, their mark of ownership on a soul and body that once served the Emperor. But the Orks have their own gods. Gork and Mork, the twin deities of Ork belief, are warp entities in their own right, though fundamentally different from the Chaos Gods in nature and origin. They are not fueled by the complex emotions of diverse races, but by the simple, focused psychic emanations of the Ork species. They do not scheme for cosmic dominance or plot to corrupt all existence. They are, in essence, the WAG given divine form, the gestalt psychic field of all Orks everywhere crystallized into two entities who represent the dual aspects of Ork nature, brutal cunning and cunning brutality. When a Helbrute in progress is captured by Orks and subjected to their modifications, when WAH energy floods into systems already saturated with warp corruption, the result is not simply the addition of one force to another. It is a collision between two different paradigms of how reality can be altered, two different cosmological systems trying to claim the same piece of material space. The Chaos Gods, or at least the dark powers they represent, do not yield willingly. Chaos corruption is designed to be permanent, irreversible, a one-way transformation that claims body and soul for eternity. Once the mutation has begun, once the warp's touch has seeped into flesh and metal, it should be impossible to reverse or redirect. The Dark God's claim is absolute, but the WAG field does not recognize absolute claims. It does not care about the theological assertions of the Chaos Gods or their supposed ownership of corrupted material. When enough Orks believe something should work a certain way, reality bends to accommodate that belief, regardless of what other forces might assert. The WAG is not trying to fight chaos in any ideological or spiritual sense. It is simply doing what it always does, making Ork technology work by imposing Ork expectations on the physical universe. The result is a stalemate that neither force expected or desired. The chaos corruption cannot be purged by the WAH field because it is too deeply embedded in the entity's structure. The mutations are part of the flesh now, the warp energies woven into the very substance of its being. But the WAG field cannot be expelled either, because it is being constantly refreshed by the presence of Orks, reinforced by their belief that their modifications should work, supported by the gestalt psychic power of the entire species. What happens in such a stalemate is unprecedented. In the rare instances where chaos forces have encountered Orks before, the interactions have been clear-cut. Either the chaos forces corrupt individual Orks, which is difficult but possible, or the Orks kill the chaos forces and loot whatever remains, which is more common. There are no examples in the established lore of a sustained structural integration between chaos corruption and Ork modifications applied to the same entity. This hybrid existence creates effects that should not be possible from either force alone. The force field that the entity generated during battle is one example. Neither warp sorcery nor WAG energy operating independently could have created that specific effect in that specific moment. It required the convergence of both, the brief synchronization of forces that normally compete, to manifest something that combined their properties. Similarly, the entity's regeneration capabilities exceed what either chaos or Ork biology should allow. Helbrutes can regenerate, to some extent, the warp energies within them, healing damage through demonic influence. Ork machines can be repaired and reinforced, their crude construction actually making them easier to fix than more sophisticated technology. But this entity does both simultaneously, flesh regenerating while metal repairs itself. the two processes intertwining in ways that create a whole stronger than either part. From a theological perspective, this raises disturbing questions about the nature of divine power in the 40K universe. If the Chaos Gods cannot assert total control over something they have already corrupted, if their eternal claim can be contested by what amounts to the collective belief of a species of fungal warriors, what does that say about the absolute power they are supposed to wield? Conversely, if the WAG field can infiltrate and coexist with warp corruption without being destroyed or corrupted itself, what does that suggest about the relationship between Ork Gestalt psychic power and the more traditional warp-based forces? Imperial theologians, if they became aware of this entity's existence, would be deeply troubled by it. Their cosmology divides the universe into the Emperor's light and the darkness of chaos, with everything else being varying shades of Xenos threat. But here is something that exists in the cracks between their categories, something that is neither wholly chaos nor wholly Ork, something that demonstrates that their binary understanding of corruption and purity is incomplete. The entity itself, trapped within this theological paradox, experiences the conflict in deeply personal terms. The fragment of consciousness that still remembers being a Space Marine understands, at some level, that it has become something that should not exist. It has not simply fallen to chaos, which would be a tragedy, but at least comprehensible within the established framework. It has become something stranger, something that its training and indoctrination never prepared it for. The warp corruption within the entity does not understand the WAG influence that constrains and modifies it. From the perspective of chaos, the Orks should not be able to do what they have done. They lack the sophistication to comprehend the warp, lack the necessary knowledge to perform the rituals that should be required to alter chaos-touched material. Yet they have done it anyway, through sheer ignorant determination backed by psychic force that operates on entirely different principles than warp sorcery. And the WAG influence, such as it is, does not understand the warp corruption. To the extent that Ork consciousness exists within the entity, it perceives the chaos elements as just more weird gubbins, more strange components that happen to be part of this particular machine. The fact that these components are manifestations of ancient evil and cosmic corruption is irrelevant. What matters is whether they make the machine fight better. This fundamental disconnect between how the two forces understand themselves and each other creates a being that is constantly in conflict with itself. Every action is a negotiation between competing impulses. Every decision is reached through a process that involves multiple fragmentary consciousnesses arguing within the same skull. The entity functions, it fights, it kills, but it does so while being pulled in different directions by forces that cannot reconcile their differences. The broader implications for the galaxy are significant, even if most inhabitants will never know this entity exists. It demonstrates that the Chaos God's corruption is not as absolute as they would like to believe. It shows that the WAH field is capable of interacting with and modifying even deeply corrupted material without being destroyed. And it suggests that there are forms of existence in the 40K universe that have not been anticipated by the major powers, forms that arise from the collision of forces rather than the dominance of any single one. If the Imperium's tech priests could study this entity, if they could understand how it functions, they might develop new approaches to fighting chaos corruption. If the Elder could examine it, they might gain insights into the relationship between warp power and material reality. If the Tau could analyze it, they would likely conclude that the entire galaxy is mad, and their philosophy of the greater good is the only sane approach. But none of these factions will get the chance to study it, because the entity belongs to the Orks now, and the Orks are not in the business of sharing their technology with anyone. They will continue to use it, continue to modify it, continue to make it stranger and more terrible with each iteration. And it will continue to be the galaxy's ugliest, most successful hybrid of forces that should never coexist. Conclusion: the horror of success. In the grim darkness of the far future, the worst outcomes are often the ones that work exactly as intended. The Orks set out to capture a powerful enemy war machine and modify it to serve their purposes. They succeeded. They wanted to create something that would kill effectively and look spectacular doing so. They succeeded. They hoped to add another weapon to their arsenal that would help them crush their enemies and move on to find new battles. They succeeded. But success, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, is often indistinguishable from horror. The entity that now fights in Ork warbands, that tears through enemy formations with weapons that combine chaos corruption and crude Ork ingenuity, is a monument to the galaxy's capacity for creating new forms of wrong. It should not exist. Every principle of theology, physics, and basic sanity says that you cannot mix warp corruption with WAG energy and get a functional result. Yet here it is, walking across battlefields, killing enemies, demonstrating through its very existence that the universe is capable of horrors that no one anticipated. The Space Marine who was originally interred in the Dreadnought, who served the Emperor faithfully before falling to chaos, who endured centuries of torment as his body was slowly corrupted and transformed, has now experienced something worse than simple corruption. He has been Orkified. Parts of his consciousness now think in Ork terms, care about Ork concerns, operate according to Ork logic. The tragedy is not just that he has fallen, but that he has fallen in multiple directions simultaneously, his identity fragmented between competing influences that will never allow him peace. The Chaos forces that originally deployed the Dreadnought have lost one of their war machines. But more significantly, they have learned that their corruption is not as absolute as they believed. If Orks can capture a mutating Helbrute and modify it successfully, what else might they do? What other eternal claims of the dark gods might prove to be negotiable when confronted with sufficient ignorance and enthusiasm? The Imperium has gained another enemy, another threat that their tactical manuals do not cover and their strategies cannot predict. When word of this entity spreads, when stories circulate among the regiments of the Astra Militarum and the chapters of the Space Marines about a chaos-corrupted Ork walker that kills with weapons that should not work and abilities that should not exist, it will add to the crushing weight of despair that already burdens those who fight for humanity's survival. But for the Orks, this is just another successful project, another example of what can be achieved with sufficient application of violence and belief. They have proven, yet again, that their approach to technology works. They have demonstrated that there are no sacred cows in Ork culture, no artifacts too dangerous to loot, no transformations too terrible to interrupt and redirect toward Orky purposes. The big mech who oversaw the modifications is already planning improvements. More weapons, obviously. Perhaps a bigger force field generator, though making that work will require considerable experimentation. Maybe some kind of teleporter system, so the entity can appear in the middle of enemy formations without having to walk there first. The possibilities are endless, and the fact that each modification risks catastrophic failure or the creation of an abomination even more terrible than what already exists is just part of the fun. This is the fundamental nature of Ork culture in the 40K universe. They are not deterred by danger, not constrained by concerns about consequences, not limited by any understanding of what should or should not be possible. They see a challenge and they attack it with hammers and welding torches and an absolute conviction that things will work out, because Gork and Mork say they should work out. Most of the time they are right, and when they are wrong, well, at least the resulting explosion is usually spectacular. The entity will continue to fight in Ork warbands until it is finally destroyed, or until it suffers some catastrophic malfunction that renders it inoperable. It might last for years, decades, even centuries if the Orks keep finding new conflicts to deploy it in. Each battle will add to its legend among the Orks, stories of Da Stompin Skullcrusher and the enemies it crushed becoming part of their oral tradition. The mech boys will continue to modify it, each generation adding their own touches, their own improvements, their own insane innovations. And through it all, the consciousness trapped within will continue to experience its existence as a fragmented nightmare, pulled between competing influences, forced to participate in atrocities against former allies, unable to die because the Orks keep repairing it, and the warp corruption keeps regenerating it, and the WH field keeps reinforcing it. This is not the eternal torment promised by chaos, but it is arguably worse because it is eternal torment without purpose, suffering without meaning, existence as a weapon wielded by those who do not understand and do not care about the cosmic significance of what they have created. In the end, the story of what happens when Orks capture a Helbrute mid-mutation is a story about the 40K universe's fundamental nature. It is a galaxy where the worst-case scenario is not just possible, but likely. Where good intentions lead to terrible outcomes, and terrible intentions somehow produce functional results. Where the line between success and catastrophe is so thin as to be meaningless, and the difference between a weapon and an abomination is purely a matter of perspective. The Orks have created something new, something unique, something that will kill effectively and look spectacular and continue to exist despite violating every principle of how things should work. They have succeeded in the way that only Orks can succeed, completely, enthusiastically, and without the slightest understanding of the theological and metaphysical chaos they have caused. And somewhere in the warp, the Chaos Gods watch this development with emotions that even they might struggle to name. Is it anger at having their corruption co-opted? Amusement at the sheer audacity of these fungal warriors? Concern that their claims of absolute power might not be as absolute as they thought? Perhaps all three, perhaps none. The gods of chaos are vast and inscrutable, and their reactions to events in the material realm are not easily predicted. What is certain is that this will not be the last time Orks interfere with forces beyond their understanding. It will not be the last time they take something that should be sacred or terrible or both and decide that it would look better painted red with some extra shooters bolted on. This is what Orks do. This is what they have always done. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there is no power in the galaxy that can make them stop. So if you find yourself on a battlefield in the 41st millennium, and you see something approaching that looks like it should not exist, that moves with mechanical precision and organic fluidity, that bristles with weapons that combine chaos corruption and Ork enthusiasm, that roars with a voice that speaks in multiple languages and serves multiple masters, do not try to understand it. Do not attempt to classify it in your tactical databases or comprehend its nature through theological study. Just run. Because that is the only sane response to what happens when Orks capture a Helbrute in the middle of mutation and decide to make it better. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the strangest possible scenarios in Warhammer 40,000, make sure to like and subscribe for more lore explorations. Share this with your fellow 40K fans who need to understand just how wrong things can go when Ork ingenuity meets chaos corruption. And remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And occasionally, there are modifications that make the war even stranger than it needed to be.